Ladies and gentlemen, are you waiting for someone to believe in you before you move? Do you feel stuck because nobody is clapping for you, walking with you, or showing up when you need them most? What if I told you that sometimes the absence of people is the presence of purpose? This speech will speak directly to those who are paralyzed by loneliness, hesitation, or a desire for external validation. It will help the listener break through the fear of being alone and awaken the courage to walk the path of destiny. Even if no one else is walking with them, there are moments in life when everything seems to go quiet. Friends drift away. Support disappears. The phone doesn't ring like it used to. Invitations stop coming. Doors that once stood open begin to shut one by one. And it's in those very moments, those quiet, soul-stretching seasons, where many begin to wonder, what did I do wrong? But perhaps the better question is, what is God trying to reveal? Because before God reveals the calling to the world, He often removes the crowd from your world. This isn't rejection. It's redirection. It's preparation. It's a holy separation. God doesn't need noise to make you known. He doesn't need a crowd to establish your calling. He often chooses solitude because solitude creates stillness, and stillness opens the ears of the soul. Some of the greatest voices in history didn't find their message among the multitudes, they found it in the wilderness. The crowd can be a comfort, but comfort can cripple calling. You don't need everyone around you to walk in what's been placed within you. You just need God. And sometimes He needs to teach you that. Think about the lives of those God raised up. Time and again, the pattern is the same. Before elevation came separation. Moses was not commissioned from the throne room of Pharaoh. He was commissioned from the wilderness, tending sheep, alone with his regret. Joseph was not promoted from the safety of home. He was isolated in a pit, sold by those closest to him, forgotten in a prison cell. David didn't step into kingship from a palace. He came in from a field where he was overlooked by even his own father. Each of these men were stripped of the crowd before they were trusted with the crown. And then there's Jesus. Before He preached His first sermon, healed His first sick body, or turned water into wine, He was led by the Spirit not into comfort, but into the wilderness. He went without food, without shelter, without company. Just Him, the Spirit, and the enemy. And it was there, in the silence, that His strength was proven. His resolve was refined. His purpose confirmed. He didn't come out of the wilderness weaker. He came out anointed. He came out ready. Not because a crowd clapped for Him, but because He obeyed in the absence of one. You may be in a season where you feel unseen, unheard, uncelebrated. But just because you are alone doesn't mean you are lost. In fact, you may be exactly where God needs you to be to speak to you without distraction. Because the voice of the crowd is loud, but it's not always right. The people around you may love you, but they don't always see what God sees. They can offer advice, but they can't define your assignment. That's why God often removes their voices, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. He wants you to stop seeking their permission and start listening for His instruction. Aloneness is not the absence of destiny. It's often the birthplace of it. When you have no one else to turn to, you turn upward. You seek deeper. You listen longer. You obey faster. You stop waiting for others to validate what God has already whispered. The quieter it gets, the clearer His voice becomes. The less you rely on people, the more you depend on Him. And in that dependence, your calling begins to unfold not as a product of popularity, but as a fruit of intimacy. You were never meant to build your purpose on the opinions of men. That foundation is too weak. That praise is too inconsistent. Today they love you, tomorrow they leave. But when your calling is founded on the voice of God, it cannot be shaken. It doesn't rise and fall with applause. It stands firm through storm and silence alike. Because what God ordains, no man can undo. And when He calls you, you don't need anyone else to come with you to confirm it. Obedience is not a group project. Some of the greatest breakthroughs you'll ever experience will not happen in a stadium. They will happen in secret, in the midnight prayers, in the lonely tears, in the moments you choose to worship when nobody else sees, in the times you keep walking when nobody else cheers. God sees you. He sees your private faithfulness. And He will reward it openly. But first, He wants to build it privately. We often want the spotlight, but we forget that God grows seeds underground. Before anything breaks the surface, it has to take root in the darkness, in the quiet, in the soil of isolation. But don't mistake isolation for punishment. It's process. It's divine strategy. God knows that what grows too fast without deep roots will wither, so He hides you, not to hinder you, but to strengthen you. Because when the moment comes and you are called into the open, you won't be shaken by criticism or seduced by applause. You will know who you are because you've spent time with the one who made you. Don't despise the season where the TV crowd disappears. Don't rush out of the quiet place looking for company. Stay long enough to hear what God is really saying. Because when He finally sends you forth, it won't be with a whisper, it will be with authority. And when that time comes, it won't matter who stayed or who left. You'll walk in confidence, not because people believe in you, but because Heaven commissioned you. And that's enough. Keynote 2. The journey of destiny is narrow and not meant for many. There is a longing inside every soul to belong, to walk alongside others who understand, to share the road with like-minded travelers. But when it comes to purpose, when it comes to the divine assignment placed upon your life, the path narrows. It doesn't widen. It doesn't become more comfortable or crowded. It becomes steep. It becomes quiet. And sometimes it becomes lonely. Because the journey to destiny is not meant for the masses. It's meant for the obedient. And obedience often separates you. There is a reason why few finish the race. There is a reason why many start strong but falter when the road becomes inconvenient. When the applause fades, when sacrifice begins to outweigh recognition. The journey of destiny is a refining fire, and not everyone wants to endure the heat. Most people will choose the path of least resistance. But the road to calling has resistance built into it. The weight of obedience will cost you comfort, friendships, and sometimes even your reputation. But it's the price of becoming what God has called you to be. Many people desire elevation, but few are willing to walk the narrow path that leads to it. Jesus said, "Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." That wasn't just about eternity. It was about the life you're called to live now. The crowd chooses the wide road because it promises ease. But the narrow road calls to the soul because it demands growth. And growth is painful. Growth means saying no when everyone else says yes. It means getting up early to pray when others are still sleeping. It means walking away from what is popular to remain aligned with what is sacred. Destiny does not bloom in the soil of consensus. It grows in conviction. It doesn't wait for a crowd to agree. It moves forward with a whisper from heaven. If you are waiting for everyone to approve, you'll be waiting forever. The narrow road is uncomfortable, not because it is wrong, but because it is right. It stirs the spirit. It calls you to carry something others don't see yet. And that weight is not shared by many. That's why you feel the burden alone. That's why you often walk alone. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're on the right path. The narrow road is not about exclusivity, it's about responsibility. God trusts some people with an assignment that others simply won't carry. Not because they're unworthy, but because they're unwilling. They want the crown, but not the cross. They want the reward, but not the refining. And so God separates those who say yes from those who merely say maybe. If you've said yes, if you've surrendered your will for His, then don't be surprised when the crowd starts thinning out. You were never called to be understood by everyone. You were called to be faithful, even if no one claps for you, even if no one walks beside you. There will be times when you look to your left and to your right and find no one there. And that's where many become discouraged. But that's also where many miss the truth. Just because the path is narrow does not mean it is empty. Heaven walks with you. Angels surround you. The Spirit of God leads you. You are not alone. You are simply uncommon. You are walking a path that was not designed for the average heart. You are walking in obedience, and obedience filters the crowd. You must understand that the road to destiny often begins with celebration but continues with isolation. People cheer when you start, but they don't always stay when the road gets hard. That's okay. That's part of the plan. If you don't learn to walk the narrow path now, you'll never be able to handle the weight of what's coming. Because calling is not glamorous, it's gritty. It's early mornings. It's silent battles. It's private tears and public courage. It's forgiving when you've been betrayed. It's giving when you feel empty. It's saying yes when everything in you wants to say no. You will encounter people who misunderstand your decisions. You will lose some who can't comprehend your discipline. You will have moments where the temptation to compromise feels easier than obedience. But every step you take on the narrow path, you're building spiritual muscle. You're growing backbone. You're becoming the kind of person God can trust with influence. Because if you cannot endure rejection in private, you will collapse under pressure in public. Don't expect many to celebrate your sacrifice. Don't wait for validation to confirm your vision. If you are walking the narrow road, you must learn to draw strength from the one who sent you. You must anchor your confidence not in how many walk with you, but in the fact that you are walking in the will of God, and His will is not always popular, but it is always perfect. The same God who called you is the same God who equips you, and He doesn't require a multitude to make you mighty. He just requires your surrender. This is why the journey of destiny isn't built on feelings, it's built on faith. And faith does not need company to move forward. Faith walks even when the path is unclear. Faith obeys even when it's misunderstood. Faith keeps going even when it walks alone. Because faith knows the road may be narrow, but the reward is eternal. It knows that obedience is never wasted, even if no one sees the steps you're taking. Destiny is not for the faint-hearted. It's for those who choose to walk forward in the face of silence, who keep climbing when the road becomes steep, who press on when the crowd disappears. There are moments in every journey where the road narrows so sharply, so silently, that it forces you into solitude, not because you asked for it, not because you prefer it, but because the people who once walked with you can no longer carry the same weight you've been called to bear. And when you find yourself walking alone, not because you failed, but because you're being led, you begin to discover something deeper than comfort. You discover presence. You discover who really walks with you when there's no spotlight, no celebration, and no applause. There is a sacred power in being stripped of dependency. When you no longer have someone to lean on, you start leaning in. You begin reaching for something higher, more eternal, more faithful than human loyalty. In that place of quiet, the soul gets honest. You start to realize that companionship, though beautiful, is not your source. People may walk beside you, but they cannot walk for you. They may encourage you, but they cannot carry your purpose. There are certain steps that only you can take, certain prayers that only you can pray, and certain trials that only you can endure. Not because you're being punished, but because you're being positioned to see clearly what you couldn't see surrounded by the noise of others. Walking alone doesn't mean you're abandoned. It means you're being refined. It means your relationship with God is maturing past the surface. See, it's easy to believe when everyone around you is clapping. It's easy to trust when doors are flying open and voices are cheering you on. But what happens when the clapping stops? What happens when the doors stay closed and the silence is deafening? That's when your faith becomes real. That's when your dependency on people shifts into intimacy with God. You stop looking for confirmation in their words and begin to hear His whisper. Many want to avoid the valley of isolation, but it's in that valley that your roots grow deep. It's in those dark, uncertain seasons that the voice of God becomes more than a verse, it becomes your survival. And in that place, you begin to understand the words, "I will never leave you nor forsake you," not as a slogan, not as a memory verse, but as a lifeline, because it's only when everyone else disappears that you realize He never did. You may have thought you needed more people to fulfill your calling, but sometimes less is more. Sometimes silence is a gift. Sometimes absence is divine protection. Because not everyone can go where you're going. Not everyone has the stamina to endure what you must face. And if you carry people who were never assigned to your journey, you'll exhaust yourself trying to keep them beside you. Some people were only meant to walk with you for a season. When the season ends, their exit is not a failure, it's a fulfillment. It's a sign you're still moving. And moving forward with God is far better than standing still with others. When you walk alone, your senses sharpen. You begin to notice what you once ignored. You feel the presence of God not just in a church building, but in your bedroom, in your car, in your most broken moments. You start to speak to Him not out of formality, but out of necessity. And He speaks back not always loudly, but always clearly. He reminds you that His presence is not dependent on your popularity. His power does not diminish when your circle shrinks. In fact, His voice often gets louder when theirs gets quieter, because now you can finally hear Him without interruption. The beauty of walking alone is that it makes you unshakable. When you've been through the fire and found that God never left you, you're no longer impressed by crowds or dependent on approval. You don't measure success by how many people surround you, but by how faithfully you followed, even when no one watched. You learn that favor doesn't always look like a full room. Sometimes it looks like being hidden, refined, and sustained by the hand of God when no one else was there to help. Many people fear loneliness because they've never seen it as preparation. But heaven often begins its greatest works in isolation. Jesus prayed alone. Moses received revelation alone. Paul wrote letters that would shape history while chained and abandoned. Even in creation, Adam was alone before Eve arrived, not because God made a mistake, but because He had something to teach him about fellowship with the Creator first. That same principle remains. You can never fully appreciate the companionship of others until you've learned to walk in communion with God first. In the stillness, you begin to ask the real questions. You stop hiding behind busyness and start confronting the truth. You find yourself, not through people's opinions, but through God's design. And when He reveals who you are in the quiet, no amount of criticism can steal it from you. You're anchored. You're focused. You're not distracted by the need to please everyone anymore because you've tasted the approval of the one who matters most. You realize that the only footsteps that truly need to match yours are the ones that walked with you when everyone else turned back. Asterisk. There is a moment in every person's journey where the weight of waiting on others becomes too heavy to carry. You reach a point where you're tired of delaying your destiny because someone else isn't ready, willing, or supportive. And it's in that sacred tension between frustration and faith where something powerful begins to shift. That's where breakthrough begins, not in the presence of help, but in the absence of it. Not when everyone shows up, but when no one does. Because breakthrough isn't born from dependency. It's born from desperation. When you stop waiting on others to move and decide to move anyway, something in the heavens starts to respond. God never designed you to rely on man more than you rely on Him. He never intended for your purpose to be paralyzed by another person's permission. But many of us live stuck not because we don't have the potential, not because we lack the calling, but because we've handed the keys to our breakthrough to people who were never meant to carry that kind of authority. We wait for applause before we act. We wait for alignment before we obey. We delay the vision because the crowd hasn't caught up. But God doesn't wait for consensus. He looks for obedience. And obedience can't afford to be tethered to approval. The truth is, many breakthroughs are delayed not by the enemy, but by our own hesitancy to walk alone. We tell ourselves that we're waiting on God, but really we're waiting on validation. We think we need more people, more encouragement, more agreement. But what we really need is to believe that if God gave the instruction, then His power is enough to complete it. You don't need a committee when you've heard from the Creator. You don't need cheerleaders when you have the command. When the voice of God has spoken, the absence of others is not an obstacle. It's an opportunity to prove your faith. Some of the greatest moves of God begin in the quiet, in the hidden places where no one else is clapping and no one else sees. Breakthrough doesn't wait for a platform. It begins in private decisions, in moments when you say yes with trembling hands, in choices that defy logic but obey the whisper. It begins when you stop shrinking your faith to fit your support system. When you step into the uncomfortable unknown, trusting that if God brought you to it, He will bring you through it. Dependence on others will always limit your potential. Because human support was never meant to be your foundation. People are a gift, but they are not your God. They can walk with you, but they cannot walk for you. And when you finally stop looking around and start looking up, you'll find strength you didn't know you had. You'll find courage rising where fear used to live. You'll discover that you were never as weak as you thought. You were just too tied to everyone else's approval to realize how strong obedience makes you. There comes a point where you must make peace with walking forward alone, not out of bitterness, not out of pride, but out of clarity. You were not built to live on borrowed faith. You cannot ride someone else's passion. You cannot wait until everyone around you feels what you feel. Some burdens were placed on your heart for a reason, because you were chosen to carry them. And when you start moving without waiting for others to understand, you unlock a realm of grace that only the obedient ever touch. You begin to experience what it means to be carried by the Spirit and not by popularity. In the Bible, God often called individuals, not groups, to take the first step. Noah built alone. Abraham left alone. Elijah stood against prophets alone. Esther walked into the king's court alone. Jesus walked to the cross alone. Why? Because when you are chosen, you must learn to trust the voice that called you more than the voices that surround you. You must become comfortable with being misunderstood, uncelebrated, even criticized. Because if you require agreement before obedience, you'll never taste the kind of breakthrough that comes from radical faith. God doesn't need a crowd to perform a miracle. He just needs your willingness, your surrender, your yes. That's where breakthrough begins. Not when conditions are perfect, but when your heart is aligned, when you're more concerned with obedience than optics, when your desire to follow God outweighs your fear of walking alone. That's when chains start breaking. That's when strongholds start crumbling. That's when doors begin to open, not because you forced them, but because you finally stepped out of the waiting room of dependency and into the battlefield of faith. You don't have to have it all figured out to begin. You don't need everyone to agree to take the first step. The power isn't in their presence, it's in your obedience. And the moment you stop leaning on their yes and start standing on God's yes, that's when everything shifts. The heavens respond to the sound of faith, not the sound of popularity. Your breakthrough has always been on the other side of your movement. It's never been about who walks with you. It's always been about who called you. The fear of doing it alone will always try to silence your momentum. It will tell you that you're not ready, that you're not supported, that you're not enough. But the truth is, the minute you stop requiring reassurance and start acting on revelation, you step into a level of authority that only comes through personal faith. The kind of faith that walks without seeing. The kind of trust that moves without confirmation. That's where miracles are born. Not in the presence of people, but in the presence of God. Not in the agreement of man, but in the command of heaven. That is where true breakthrough lives on the other side of human dependence. In the fullness of divine direction, there comes a point in every life when the road grows quiet, the noise fades, and the only sound you hear is your own breath, your own heartbeat, your own footsteps. And in that moment, you face a decision that will define the course of your calling. Will you wait for others to join you, or will you move with only the voice of God guiding you? The truth is, every great move of God has been born not from comfort, but from courage, not from crowds, but from conviction. You were not called to fit in. You were called to be faithful. You were not chosen to blend in with the noise of the world, but to stand boldly, even when no one else understands. If your obedience depends on company, you'll never fulfill the assignment that was meant to set you apart. You must learn to walk when no one else is walking, to build when no one else believes, to pray when no one else is listening, to move when no one else is moving. That is where destiny begins. That is where character is formed. That is where God speaks when you dare to do it alone. The seasons of separation are not setbacks, they are sacred. They are where you find out who you really are. More importantly, they are where you find out who God really is. He is not just the God of the multitudes. He is the God who walks beside you when the world turns away. He is not just present in the spotlight, He is with you in the shadows. He strengthens the steps of the one who keeps walking with tear-stained eyes and a surrendered heart. And it is in that surrender, that raw, unfiltered obedience, where true power begins to rise. You don't need to wait for the world to understand your vision. You don't need to explain your burden to those who were never given the weight of it. You don't need the crowd to affirm what heaven has already ordained. All you need is the courage to walk step by step, breath by breath, prayer by prayer into the purpose that was placed inside of you before anyone else had a chance to approve it. You have been chosen. You have been called. And even if no one else sees it yet, you must still rise. You must still obey. You must still do it alone.